So firstly, apologies for the random location. I'm currently in Helsinki meeting with a game developer that I'm working for, but I wanted to record something for this week and get ahead, well, next week at the moment, but it will be this week when you see the video. And I wanted to get ahead and sort of do something ahead of schedule. So I'm going to be talking today about Hans Zimmer strings. It stood out to me in a lot of ways when they presented it, partly because of the amount of hype that surrounded it. For instance, the fact that they had this fantastic marketing campaign with things like offering this book to people that pre-ordered the library. This library retails for £699 or about $900, so that cost more than my first car. I didn't buy it for full price because I got it on pre-order, which is also the reason I got this book. Even though I have quite a lot of positive things to say about it as a library, I'm not sure that it justifies the price tag. Things that I did like. I liked the look of the GUI, the way that it was presented, and the way that it's its own separate plugin, which doesn't seem to be taking up much CPU. Compared to some Contact libraries and East-West libraries, it's quite light on CPU usage. I liked some of the samples. There was some really, really nice staccato and col legno, especially the quieter stuff, I found was really, really delicate and lovely for some compositions, but somewhat limited in its usage. I like this book. I did want to talk about this just briefly because I thought it was quite interesting. I really kind of expected there to be like a behind-the-scenes diagram of how the whole library was put together. Descriptions about how the mics were set up. And I know all this stuff was kind of included online, but I just thought the book would have all of it together and it'd be quite nice. As it happens, we have this really nice foreword by one of the co-founders of the company, Paul Thompson. Following that, there's some really, really lovely photos of cellos, the orchestra that was playing, and at the very end, Hans Zimmer's studio. But that's it. There's nothing else. There's no descriptions about how it's recorded, how it's set up, any inspirational quotes from Hans Zimmer, that kind of thing. I guess it's quite nice to sort of go to if I'm feeling a bit uninspired and I fancy sort of looking at some really nice pictures, and they are beautiful pictures, looking at some nice pictures of the orchestra playing and think, yeah, and then go back to writing again. It does also smell quite nice. Like really nice. Like, you know when you go to like a Waterstones and you buy a new book and it's got that new book smell? So I'm going to talk about my problems with the library and why I don't think it's a good investment, especially if you're new to the film music and epic music genre and just sort of just getting into writing and producing on the computer. I don't think this is a good library for anyone to be starting out with, or even if you're building up your libraries and want something for big symphonic epic works. The reason I say big symphonic epic works is because this is marketed as an instrument which is used for Hans Zimmer-esque, epic, over-the-top. This is an orchestra that is bigger than any orchestra ever recorded before. They recorded it section by section and made the sections so big that you couldn't realistically have the orchestra in an actual live space, which means it sounds kind of strange. One of my favourite investments from Spitfire so far has been chamber strings, which is their small string section. That sounds very delicate, very intimate, especially if you put it on close mic settings. When you then go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum and you have so many players, the individuality of each instrument is lost and you end up with something that kind of just sounds a bit synthy. And this is really apparent with the legato patches and the sustains, just like the basic string sounds you just hear, the overall splurge of epic sound. And it doesn't really sound that real. The stronger stuff is when it's the orchestra playing quietly. Which leads me to the next problem with the whole library, which is I kind of bought it expecting it to sound like typical Hans Zimmer music, so Inception, Interstellar, and that kind of sound. Instead, Spitfire have focused really heavily on doing the very quiet, very intimate sound. I think I kind of was hoping for the price I was kind of hoping that Hans Zimmer would walk in the room and write it. For the price, I thought that the big, loud, epic stuff would be really, really easy and straightforward to do. That I actually did a piece inspired by Hans Zimmer, and in that piece I used this library for a grand total of 2 tracks. So yes, really weirdly, it's too splurgy on the big epic stuff, which is why most people bought the library, I think. And then the really good, well-presented, well-made stuff, the quieter stuff, isn't particularly useful. I think what everyone was hoping with this Hans Zimmer strings, biggest orchestra ever recorded, we were hoping for the big, grandiose, epic Hans Zimmer. And in this library, that part of his music just isn't focused on very well. For delicate and intricate textures, I don't find myself using it very often at all. I find myself gravitating back towards chamber strings.
So I'm back in the studio and I'm going to be talking a little bit more in depth about the GUI and some of my issues with it. I think it's very beautiful to look at. However, I think there's a slight case of form over function. And if you're sort of doing a few basic things here and there with textures and just opening it up quickly and then playing, it's fine. But when you're trying to sort of go into more depth and change mic positions, samples, round robins if you want them, it's quite counterintuitive. So for instance, we have this section at the top with 2 faders and a knob. Christian Henson actually said on one of his videos that this is sort of what Spitfire is striving towards with their interfaces for all virtual instruments in the future, which is good. If you're working with, say, Spitfire Labs felt piano, you have the option to change the reverb and the expression to make it louder or quieter. For that, this interface works perfectly. However, with this interface, I find myself having to click this knob quite often because very often it's not set to the correct parameter that I'm wanting to change. It's quite weird that I've got that up there, but also if I click down here at the bottom on effects, I've got the same controls, but at the expense of having the mic positions available. I'm not a huge fan of Contact. At least with the Spitfire layout on there, you have everything you need on one screen. And then if we look up here at the top, we have this drop-down list for all the instruments. To me, it just feels like there might have been a better way of organising it, because this is absolutely huge. And okay, so I can filter out things on the left by pressing one of the individual instruments, such as violins, and then I get all of the violins patches, but that's still at least 100, a lot of sorting through to find the instrument that I'm looking for. Well, the weird thing is that some sections have some effects and playing techniques that other sections don't. So if you want some scraping, sort of horror scrapes and rises, they are on violins right, but they're not on centre and they're not on left and they're not on 60 violins, they're only on 20. I've been looking at a little bit more of the behind the scenes stuff as it's been a while since I've looked at it, and a lot of people are saying it's kind of up to the user to make the most of this library. It's very technical. I would argue that for a consumer product to be good, it should be pretty user-friendly. This is a little bit on the tricky side. It's not as user-friendly as it could be, even though it does look beautiful. So as a conclusion, I would say that I wouldn't particularly recommend spending the money on this instrument if you're looking for a core string library. If you have the money spare and you need an additional string library for textures, it is pretty good. However, for me, the lack of focus on the traditional Hans Zimmer that we were all kind of hoping for, I think, means that the library's a bit confused as to what it wants to be, and what with the GUI being a little bit clunky and some of the samples such as legatos being virtually unusable, I would say that its uses as a library are fairly limited, especially when you consider how much it costs. Do feel free to disagree with me, because my opinion isn't more important than anybody else's. I'm just sharing my current experience with you, and hopefully if it helps you make a decision, then all the better for it.
If you do have £700 to spend on some string libraries, my recommendation is invest in chamber strings. The good news is at least I can smell this book. That's it for me here today, but I'm going to go back to exploring Helsinki, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.